You pour your heart into presentations, yet watch colleagues with half your expertise command the room and get the recognition. Every conversation feels like a struggle to be heard, while others effortlessly draw people in and inspire action. With what seems like natural charisma, I am Dale Carnegie, and I spent decades studying what makes some people magnetic, while others remain invisible, even when they have brilliant ideas. What I discovered about genuine influence will transform how people respond to you, giving you the ability to connect authentically and inspire others to action. The same principles that helped millions of students worldwide can bridge the gap between having great ideas and getting people to embrace them. But first, like this video, subscribe for more life-changing insights, and comment below where you're watching from. I want to know which corner of the world is ready for transformation. Let me take you back to 1912, when I was a struggling salesman carrying a worn leather satchel filled with dreams and determination, but also something else I didn't want to admit: failure. I still have those crumpled sales reports somewhere, stained with coffee and marked with red ink, showing week after week of missed quotas and lost prospects. I thought I knew everything about selling. I had memorized every feature of my products, practiced my presentations in the mirror until my jaw ached, and could recite benefits faster than an auctioneer could call bids. Yet day after day, I watched potential customers' eyes glaze over as I launched into my well-rehearsed speeches. They would nod politely, thank me for my time, and then buy from my competitors who seemed to barely try. The breaking point came on a particularly brutal Tuesday in Kansas City. I had just finished what I considered my most compelling presentation ever to a potential client, a hardware store owner who needed exactly what I was selling. I had covered every angle, answered every objection before he could voice it, and painted a picture of success so vivid I could practically see the dollar signs in his eyes. He listened patiently, asked a few questions, and then said something that changed my life forever. "Mr. Carnegie, you clearly know your products, but I don't think you know me." Those words hit me like a physical blow. I walked out of that store not with a sale, but with a revelation that would transform everything. I thought I knew about influence. I realized I had been approaching people like they were obstacles to overcome, rather than human beings with their own hopes, fears, and desires. That night, in my small boarding house room, I made a decision that would shape the rest of my life. Instead of focusing on what I wanted to sell, I would focus on understanding what people wanted to buy. Instead of talking about my products, I would ask about their problems. Instead of trying to impress them with my knowledge, I would become genuinely interested in their world. The next morning, I returned to the same hardware store owner, but this time with a completely different approach. Instead of launching into my presentation, I asked him about his business, his challenges, his dreams for growth. I really listened as he told me about his struggles with inventory, his concerns about competition, and his hopes for expanding into new product lines. Only after I understood his world did I mention how my products might fit into his vision, but even then, I didn't present them as solutions I was pushing on him. I offered them as tools that might help him achieve what he had already told me he wanted. The result: not only did he buy everything I had hoped to sell him, but he also introduced me to 3 other business owners who became customers. More importantly, I had discovered the fundamental principle that would guide everything I would later teach. People don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. This transformation didn't happen overnight. I spent months unlearning everything I thought I knew about influence and relearning it through the lens of genuine human interest. I started keeping detailed notes about every person I met, not just their business needs, but their personal interests, their family situations, their dreams and concerns. I discovered that my best customers weren't buying products, they were buying relationships. They were investing in someone who understood them, appreciated them, and genuinely wanted to help them succeed. This realization became the foundation of everything I would later teach about winning friends and influencing people. I want you to meet someone who taught me one of the most profound lessons about human nature I've ever learned. His name was Tippy, and he was a small, scrappy terrier who belonged to my neighbor in Missouri. Every morning, Tippy would bound across the yard to greet me with such genuine enthusiasm that it made my entire day brighter. He never asked for anything except a moment of my attention, yet somehow he made me feel like the most important person in the world. One day, as I watched Tippy's tail wagging furiously at my approach, it struck me with startling clarity. This little dog understood something about human nature that most people never grasp. He had discovered the secret to making others feel genuinely appreciated, and he practiced it with pure, unconscious joy. That moment of insight led me to what I now consider the foundation of all influence, the deep, driving desire that exists in every human heart to feel appreciated and valued. I began to study this principle in my daily interactions, and what I discovered changed everything I thought I knew about moving people to action. You see, most people approach influence backward. They focus on what they want to get from others, rather than what they can give. They think about their own needs, their own goals, their own success. But here's what I learned from years of observation. People are primarily interested in themselves, not in you or me. They think about their own problems, their own achievements, their own concerns from morning until night. This isn't selfishness, it's human nature. And once you truly understand this truth, it becomes the key to unlocking genuine influence. When you make others feel appreciated and important, you're feeding the deepest hunger of the human soul. I remember a particularly difficult situation early in my teaching career. I had a student named Robert who seemed determined to disrupt every class. He would argue with every point, challenge every example, and generally make life miserable for everyone around him. Other instructors had labeled him as troublesome and suggested he be removed from the program. But I decided to try a different approach. Instead of confronting his disruptive behavior, I began looking for opportunities to genuinely appreciate his contributions. When he raised an objection, I would say, "Robert, that's an excellent point. That shows you're really thinking deeply about this material." When he challenged an example, I would respond with, "You've identified something important that I should have explained more clearly." The transformation was remarkable. Within weeks, Robert became one of my most engaged and helpful students. He wasn't a difficult person at heart. He was simply someone whose need for appreciation had never been satisfied. Once that need was met, his natural intelligence and enthusiasm emerged. This experience taught me the crucial difference between flattery and genuine appreciation. Flattery is shallow, insincere, and focused on getting something in return. It's like cheap cologne, one can smell it from a mile away. Genuine appreciation, on the other hand, comes from truly observing and valuing the good qualities in others. The power of appreciation extends far beyond individual relationships. I've seen it transform businesses, heal family conflicts, and create opportunities that seemed impossible. When you make appreciation a daily habit, you become a magnet for cooperation, loyalty, and genuine affection. Yet most people are stingy with their appreciation, as if kind words were gold coins that would make them poorer for giving them away. They notice mistakes quickly but overlook achievements. They remember what went wrong but forget what went right. This scarcity of appreciation creates an opportunity for anyone willing to become generous with genuine recognition. Keep a letter in my desk drawer that arrived 23 years after I taught a young woman named Margaret in one of my first public speaking classes. She wrote to tell me that something I said to her during that course had changed the entire direction of her life. What struck me most about her letter wasn't just her success. She had become a respected business leader, But what she remembered most vividly from our time together, it wasn't any of the speaking techniques I had taught her. It wasn't the structured presentations or the confidence-building exercises. What she remembered was a single moment when I noticed she was struggling with self-doubt and said, "Margaret, you have insights that this room needs to hear. Your perspective is valuable, and I hope you'll share it with us." That brief recognition of her worth had awakened something in her that transformed not just her speaking ability, but her entire sense of self. It taught me a profound truth. Everyone you meet is carrying an invisible sign that reads, "Make me feel important." The challenge is that most people are walking around feeling unimportant, unnoticed, and undervalued. They go through their days wondering if anyone truly sees their contributions, appreciates their efforts, or recognizes their worth. This creates an incredible opportunity for anyone willing to become skilled at making others feel genuinely significant. I learned this lesson in a very personal way during my early days as an instructor. I was teaching a class filled with successful business professionals, people who seemed confident and accomplished. Yet as I got to know them individually, I discovered that even the most successful among them harbored deep insecurities about their value and importance. There was James, a successful insurance executive who confided that he constantly worried his colleagues saw him as expendable. Sarah, a talented accountant who believed her contributions went unnoticed because she wasn't as outspoken as others. Thomas, a small business owner who felt insignificant compared to larger competitors. I began an experiment that would shape my teaching philosophy forever. Instead of focusing solely on skill development, I made it my mission to help each student recognize their unique importance and value. I looked for specific qualities that made each person special and found ways to acknowledge those qualities genuinely and specifically. With James, I highlighted his remarkable ability to simplify complex concepts for others. With Sarah, I noted how her thoughtful questions always led to deeper insights. With Thomas, I recognized his talent for building genuine relationships with his customers. The results were extraordinary. As each person began to feel truly important and valued, their confidence grew, their contributions increased, and their willingness to take on new challenges expanded dramatically. They weren't just learning public speaking skills, they were discovering their own significance. This experience taught me that making others feel important isn't about empty praise or superficial compliments. It requires genuine observation, specific recognition, and authentic appreciation for what makes each person unique. It means looking beyond the surface to discover the special qualities that others might overlook. I discovered there are specific ways to make this principle work in everyday interactions. When someone shares an idea, I learned to respond with specific appreciation. That suggestion shows real creative thinking, rather than just good idea. When someone completes a task, I would acknowledge not just the result, but the qualities that made it possible. Your attention to detail really shows in this work. The key is specificity and authenticity. Generic praise feels hollow, but specific. Recognition of genuine qualities creates a lasting impact. When you notice and acknowledge the unique value that each person brings, you're not just being kind, you're helping them see themselves more clearly and inspiring them to live up to their best potential. I've watched this principle transform difficult relationships, improve team performance, and create loyalty that lasts for decades. People never forget how you made them feel, especially when you made them feel important and valued. In a world where most people feel overlooked and underappreciated, the person who consistently makes others feel significant becomes irresistibly influential. I had the extraordinary privilege of meeting Theodore Roosevelt during his post-presidency years, and I'll never forget walking into his study at Sagamore Hill. Within minutes of our introduction, he was asking me detailed questions about my work, my background, and my observations about human nature. What amazed me wasn't just his interest, but how quickly I felt like the most fascinating person in the room. Later, I learned that Roosevelt had spent the hour before our meeting reading about my teaching methods and background. He had prepared specific questions that showed genuine curiosity about my work. This wasn't political courtesy, it was authentic interest in another human being. That experience taught me why Roosevelt was so beloved. He had mastered the art of becoming genuinely interested in others. Most people have this principle completely backward. They work exhaustively to become interesting, developing impressive credentials, accumulating achievements, perfecting their presentation skills. But Roosevelt showed me the real secret. If you want to be interesting to others, become genuinely interested in them. I began studying this principle systematically, and what I discovered revolutionized my understanding of human connection. When you show authentic interest in another person's world, something magical happens. Their defenses lower, their enthusiasm rises, and they begin to see you as someone special, not because of what you've accomplished, but because of how you make them feel about themselves. I remember experimenting with this principle during a particularly challenging period in my career. I was trying to win the support of a school administrator who had been resistant to my teaching methods. Instead of trying to impress him with my credentials or argue the merits of my approach, I decided to become genuinely interested in his world. I asked him about his background in education, his challenges in running the school, his vision for student development. I listened carefully to his concerns about traditional teaching methods and his hopes for innovation. I inquired about his family, his interests outside of work, his thoughts on educational trends. What happened over the following weeks surprised us both. As I continued to show genuine interest in his perspectives and challenges, he began to open up about his goals and concerns. He started asking for my input on various educational challenges. Eventually, he became one of my strongest advocates, not because I had convinced him of anything, but because I had shown authentic interest in his world. This experience taught me the difference between feigned interest and genuine curiosity. Feigned interest is a technique, a surface-level attempt to manipulate others through false attention. Genuine interest, however, comes from authentic curiosity about the complexity and uniqueness of every human being you meet. I learned to ask myself questions that deepened my natural curiosity. What unique experiences has this person had? What challenges are they facing that I might not see on the surface? What dreams and aspirations drive their daily decisions? What could I learn from their perspective that might broaden my own understanding? The key insight was that genuine interest requires a fundamental shift in mindset. Instead of approaching interactions with the question, how can I get what I want from this person? I learned to ask, what can I discover about this person that will help me understand their world better? This shift creates a remarkable transformation in how others respond to you. When people sense that your interest in them is authentic, they become more open, more cooperative, and more willing to invest in a relationship with you. They begin to associate you with the positive feelings that come from being truly seen and understood. I discovered that genuine interest is like a rare gift in human interaction. Most people spend their days feeling unseen and misunderstood. When you offer the gift of authentic attention and curiosity, you stand out dramatically from the crowd. You become someone they want to be around, someone they trust, someone they remember. The beautiful irony is that when you stop trying to be interesting and start being interested, you naturally become more interesting to others. You're genuine. Curiosity leads to better questions, deeper insights, and more meaningful conversations. People begin to see you as wise, perceptive, and engaging, not because you're performing, but because you're genuinely connecting. This principle has the power to transform any relationship, whether personal or professional. When you approach others with authentic curiosity about their world, you create the foundation for trust, cooperation, and lasting influence. I used to carry a small leather notebook everywhere I went, filled with names, personal details, and brief notes about everyone I met. My colleagues thought I was obsessive, but that little notebook became one of my most powerful tools for building relationships and influence. You see, I had learned something that most people never fully grasp. A person's name is, to that person, the sweetest and most important sound in any language. The revelation came to me during a particularly embarrassing moment early in my career. I was at a business gathering where I encountered someone I had met several times before. He greeted me warmly by name, asked about my recent projects, and even remembered details about my family. Meanwhile, I stood there, desperately trying to recall his name, hoping he wouldn't notice my obvious discomfort. The contrast was stark and humbling. While he made me feel important and remembered, I made him feel forgotten and insignificant. That night, I made a commitment that would transform my relationships. I would never again allow someone to feel unimportant because I failed to remember their name. I developed a systematic approach that served me well throughout my career. The moment someone introduced themselves, I would repeat their name immediately. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Robert." I would use their name several times during our conversation, always naturally and appropriately. If it was an unusual name, I would ask about its origin or spelling, which not only helped me remember, but showed additional interest in them as a person. But the real magic happened with my notebook system. After every meeting or gathering, I would spend a few minutes writing down not just names, but personal details that would help me connect more meaningfully in future encounters. Next to Robert Thompson, I might write insurance agent, to young daughters, plays golf, concerned about industry changes. The results were extraordinary. People would light up when I greeted them by name weeks or months later. They were amazed when I asked about their daughter's piano recital or their recent golf game. What seemed like an exceptional memory was actually a simple system combined with genuine interest in others. I remember one particularly powerful example of this principle in action. During a series of lectures in Chicago, I met a young businessman named William who seemed discouraged about his career prospects. When I saw him again 6 months later in New York, I not only remembered his name but asked specifically about the new business venture he had mentioned during our first conversation. The impact was immediate and profound. William's face transformed. With surprise and pleasure, he told me later that in a room full of important people, I was the only one who had made him feel truly seen and remembered. That moment of recognition gave him the confidence boost he needed to pursue his entrepreneurial dreams, which eventually led to remarkable success. This experience taught me that remembering names isn't just about social courtesy, is about affirming someone's importance and value. When you remember and use someone's name, you're sending a powerful message. You matter to me. You're important enough for me to remember. The principle works because names are intimately connected to our sense of identity and self-worth. From the moment we're born, our name becomes the most personal and important word in our vocabulary. When someone uses our name thoughtfully and naturally, it creates an immediate sense of connection and importance. I discovered that this simple practice, remembering and using names, could open doors that seemed permanently closed. Business prospects became more receptive. Students became more engaged. Even difficult personalities became more cooperative when they felt the respect that comes from being remembered and acknowledged by name. The investment in learning and remembering names pays dividends far beyond what most people imagine. It's not just about being polite or making a good impression. It's about making others feel valued and important. And when people feel valued by you, they become infinitely more willing to listen to your ideas, support your initiatives, and invest in building a relationship with you. In a world where people often feel anonymous and forgotten, the simple act of remembering and using their name makes you stand out as someone who truly cares about them as individuals. I conducted an experiment that changed my understanding of human communication forever. For one entire week, I made a conscious decision to speak as little as possible in social and business interactions. Instead, I would ask thoughtful questions and then simply really listen to what others had to say. The results were so dramatic that I almost couldn't believe them. People who had previously seemed disinterested in conversations with me suddenly became animated and engaged. Business associates who had been merely polite began sharing their real concerns and challenges. Students who had been quiet in class started opening up with insights and questions that enriched our entire learning experience. The most striking discovery was how starved people were for genuine listening. Most individuals spend their days surrounded by noise, but rarely experience the gift of being truly heard. When I offered that gift through focused, attentive listening, people responded as if I had given them something precious and rare. I remember one particular conversation with a colleague named Arthur, who had always seemed somewhat distant and difficult to connect with. During a business lunch, instead of dominating the conversation with my own thoughts and experiences, I asked him about his work challenges and then listened intently to his response. What unfolded was remarkable. Arthur began sharing his frustrations about workplace politics, his concerns about industry changes, and his dreams for professional growth. As I continued to listen without interrupting or trying to offer immediate solutions, he grew more open and enthusiastic. By the end of our meal, he was saying things like, "Dale, you really understand these issues, and I appreciate how you see the situation." The irony was striking. By saying less, I had become more influential. By focusing on understanding rather than being understood, I had gained his respect and trust in ways that my previous attempts at an impressive conversation never achieved. This experience taught me that most people are poor listeners because they're too busy preparing their own responses. While the other person is talking, they're formulating their next comment, thinking about their own similar experiences, or planning how to steer the conversation back to their interests. They're present physically, but absent mentally. True listening requires a different approach entirely. It means setting aside your own agenda temporarily and becoming genuinely curious about the other person's thoughts, feelings, and perspectives. It means asking follow-up questions that show you're engaged. What happened next? How did that make you feel? What do you think would help? I learned to listen not just to the words being spoken, but to the emotions behind them. When someone described a workplace challenge, I listened for the frustration, anxiety, or hope in their voice. When they shared an achievement, I heard the pride and satisfaction that accompanied their words. This deeper level of listening allowed me to respond with greater empathy and understanding. The power of listening extends far beyond making others feel good. When you truly listen, you gain valuable insights into what motivates people, what concerns them, and what they value most. This understanding becomes the foundation for more effective communication and influence in future interactions. I discovered that listening is also a powerful tool for diffusing tension and resolving conflicts. When people feel heard and understood, their defensiveness decreases and their willingness to find solutions increases. Some of my most successful interventions in difficult situations came not from brilliant advice or persuasive arguments, but from patient, empathetic listening. The challenge for most people is that listening feels passive when they want to be active, quiet when they want to be noticed, and slow when they want to make quick progress. But I learned that listening is actually one of the most active and powerful things you can do in any interaction. When you become known as an excellent listener, people begin seeking you out. They want to share their ideas with you, ask for your input on important decisions, and include you in significant conversations. You become someone they trust and value, not because of what you say, but because of how well you listen to what they say. In a world full of people desperately wanting to be heard, the person who masters the art of listening becomes irresistibly attractive and influential. I keep a simple drawing in my desk that has guided my approach to influence for decades. It's a sketch of a fisherman holding two different types of bait, a strawberry and a worm. The caption reads, "Which would you use to catch fish?" This crude illustration represents one of the most important lessons I ever learned about human motivation. The obvious answer is the worm, because that's what fish want, not what the fisherman wants. Yet most people approach influence exactly backward. They talk about what they want rather than what the other person wants. They use strawberries when they should be using worms. This principle became crystal clear to me during an interaction with a wealthy businessman who was considering donating to a charitable cause I supported. My initial approach was to talk about the organization's mission, its financial needs, and the importance of charitable giving in general. He listened politely but showed little enthusiasm. Then I remembered my fishing principle. Instead of talking about what we needed, I started asking about what mattered to him. I discovered that his greatest pride was in his 3 children and his desire to leave them a legacy beyond money. He wanted them to understand the importance of contributing to society and making a positive difference in the world. I immediately shifted my approach. Instead of talking about our organization's needs, I focused on how his involvement could demonstrate leadership and civic responsibility to his children. I described how his support could become a family tradition of giving, creating opportunities for his children to learn about making a meaningful impact on their community. The transformation was immediate. He became animated and engaged, asking detailed questions about how he could involve his family in the charitable work. Within a week, he had not only made a substantial donation, but had also recruited 2 of his business associates to support the cause. The difference wasn't in what I asked for, it was in how I connected my request to what he truly cared about. This experience taught me that everyone is tuned to the same radio station, WIIFM. What's in it for me? This isn't selfishness, it's human nature. People are naturally most interested in things that relate to their own concerns, goals, and desires. When you learn to speak in terms of what others want, you capture their attention and interest in ways that focusing on your own needs never can. I began studying successful salespeople, effective leaders, and persuasive speakers to understand how they applied this principle. What I found was that the most influential people had mastered the art of translating their requests into the language of others' interests. When a master salesperson wanted to sell a security system, they didn't talk about features and specifications. Instead, they talked about peace of mind for the customer's family. When an effective manager wanted to implement a new procedure, they didn't focus on company efficiency. Instead, they emphasized how the change would make employees' work easier and more satisfying. The key insight was learning to ask the right questions to discover what truly mattered to each person. What are their main concerns? What goals are they trying to achieve? What problems keep them awake at night? What dreams energize them during the day? Once you understand these driving forces, you can frame any request or proposal in terms that naturally appeal to their interests. I developed a simple mental exercise that transformed my communication effectiveness. Before any important conversation, I would ask myself, if I were in their shoes, with their responsibilities and concerns, what would I want to hear? How could this benefit them in ways they would find meaningful? This shift in perspective changed everything. Instead of trying to convince people to care about my agenda, I learned to align my agenda with theirs. Instead of pushing against their natural interests, I learned to flow with them. The result was dramatically less resistance and significantly more cooperation. The principle works because it makes others feel understood and valued. When you speak in terms of their interests, You're demonstrating that you see the world from their perspective and care about their success. This creates a foundation of trust and rapport that makes all future communication more effective. People don't want to feel like they're being sold or manipulated. They want to feel like they're making decisions that serve their own best interests. When you learn to present your ideas in terms of what others want and need, you're not being manipulative, you're being helpful and considerate. I have a letter in my files that represents one of my most important lessons about human nature and influence. It's a handwritten apology I sent to a student named Helen after I had criticized her presentation in front of the entire class. At the time, I thought I was being helpful by pointing out her mistakes. Instead, I had humiliated her and damaged her confidence in ways I didn't fully understand until later. The letter took me hours to write because I had to overcome my own pride and ego to admit that I had been wrong. But sending that apology transformed not only my relationship with Helen, who became one of my most dedicated students, but also my entire understanding of how to correct others without destroying their self-esteem. That experience taught me a crucial principle: you can disagree with someone's ideas while still allowing them to save face and maintain their dignity. In fact, learning to make others feel like winners, even when pointing out their mistakes, became one of my most valuable skills as a teacher and communicator. The traditional approach to correction is like a sledgehammer: direct, forceful, and usually destructive to relationships. Most people, when they spot an error or disagree with an idea, immediately point it out with little consideration for the other person's feelings. They say things like, "You're wrong about that," or "That's not how it works," or "Let me correct you." While these responses might be factually accurate, they create defensive reactions that make productive communication nearly impossible. When you tell someone they're wrong, you're not just challenging their idea, challenging their intelligence, their judgment, and their self-worth. Even if they eventually agree with your correction, they'll harbor resentment about how you made them feel. I learned to approach disagreements and corrections with a completely different strategy. Instead of directly contradicting someone, I would find ways to acknowledge their perspective while gently introducing alternative viewpoints. I might say, "That's an interesting way to look at it. I wonder if there might be another angle to consider," or "You've raised a good point. Here's something that might add to that thinking." This approach accomplished several important things simultaneously. It allowed the other person to maintain their dignity and self-respect. It reduced their natural defensiveness and kept them open to new information. And it positioned me as a collaborator rather than an adversary in the search for better solutions. I remember working with a business executive named Charles, who had developed a marketing strategy that I believed contained some significant flaws. Instead of pointing out what was wrong with his approach, I began by acknowledging the strengths of his thinking. "Charles, I can see you've put considerable thought into understanding our target market, and your emphasis on customer service is exactly right." Only after establishing this foundation of respect did I introduce my concerns, but I framed them as additions rather than corrections. "I wonder if we might also consider how seasonal trends could affect this strategy. Or, what do you think about also exploring some alternative distribution channels?" This approach allowed Charles to incorporate my suggestions while feeling like he was improving his own idea rather than abandoning it. He remained enthusiastic about the project and even thanked me for helping him strengthen his strategy. The final plan was significantly different from his original concept, but he felt like a winner throughout the entire process. The key insight was understanding that people need to feel good about themselves and their contributions. When you find ways to build on their ideas rather than tear them down, when you acknowledge their good intentions, even when pointing out better methods, you create an environment where learning and growth can flourish. This principle extends far beyond business interactions. I've seen it work in marriages, friendships, and family relationships. When you learn to correct without criticizing, to disagree without attacking, and to improve ideas without destroying egos, you become someone others want to work with and learn from. The most powerful part of this approach is that it often leads to better outcomes than direct confrontation. When people feel respected and valued, they become more open to new ideas and more willing to consider alternative perspectives. They stop defending their original position and start collaborating on finding the best solution. Making others feel like winners doesn't mean avoiding difficult conversations or failing to address important issues. It means approaching those conversations with skill, empathy, and respect for human dignity. When you master this art, you can achieve your goals while strengthening rather than damaging your relationships. I received one of the harshest pieces of criticism in my career from a newspaper reporter who attended one of my early lectures. His review was brutal, calling my methods simplistic, my examples contrived, and my overall approach a waste of intelligent people's time. My first instinct was to defend myself, to write a scathing response pointing out his misunderstandings and biases. Instead, I did something that surprised everyone, including myself. I wrote him a letter thanking him for his honest feedback and asking if he would be willing to meet with me to discuss his concerns in more detail. That letter led to a conversation that not only improved my teaching, but also turned a harsh critic into one of my most valuable advisors. This experience taught me one of the most counterintuitive lessons about handling criticism. The fastest way to disarm critics is to agree with them wherever possible and then learn from their feedback. Most people expect you to fight back when criticized, so when you respond with openness and genuine curiosity, it completely changes the dynamic of the interaction. The secret lies in understanding what's really happening when someone criticizes you. In most cases, they're not trying to destroy you, they're trying to be heard, to feel important, or to express frustration about something that matters to them. When you respond defensively, you're denying them the satisfaction of being heard and understood, which only escalates their criticism. But when you respond with genuine interest in their perspective, something remarkable happens. Their anger dissipates because you're giving them what they really wanted: acknowledgement and respect for their viewpoint. Even if their criticism is unfair or inaccurate, you can usually find some element of truth to acknowledge. I learned to use a formula that transformed how I handled criticism. You know, you may be right about that. I hadn't considered that perspective. Can you help me understand your thinking better? This response accomplishes several things simultaneously. It shows respect for their opinion, demonstrates your openness to learning, and invites them to become your teacher rather than your adversary. I remember a particularly challenging situation with a school administrator who was highly critical of my teaching methods. Instead of defending my approach, I said, "I can see why you might have concerns about these techniques. What specific problems do you think they might create?" This question led to a detailed discussion of his fears about non-traditional education methods. As I listened to his concerns, I began to understand the pressures he faced from conservative board members and traditional educators. His criticism wasn't really about my methods, it was about his need to protect the school's reputation and his own position. Once I understood his real concerns, I was able to address them directly and even modify my approach to help him feel more comfortable supporting my work. The most powerful discovery was that critics often provide valuable insights that supporters never offer. People who, like you, are usually too polite to point out your blind spots and weaknesses. Critics, however, will highlight exactly the areas where you need to improve. When you learn to extract the valuable feedback from their criticism while ignoring the emotional attacks, you gain access to information that can dramatically improve your effectiveness. This doesn't mean accepting all criticism as valid or allowing others to abuse you emotionally. The key is learning to separate the useful information from the emotional charge. You can acknowledge someone's right to their opinion while still maintaining your own standards and boundaries. I developed a practice of asking myself specific questions when receiving criticism. What can I learn from this feedback? Is there any truth here that I need to consider? What improvements could I make based on this input? This approach helped me extract value from even the most poorly delivered criticism. The ultimate irony is that when you handle criticism well, you often end up with stronger relationships than you had before the criticism occurred. People respect those who can receive feedback gracefully and learn from it. They begin to see you as someone who is secure enough to grow and improve, which makes them more likely to trust and support you in the future. By learning to welcome criticism as a gift rather than an attack, you transform one of life's most challenging experiences into one of its most valuable learning opportunities. I discovered one of the most powerful techniques for gaining cooperation during a conversation with a reluctant student who seemed determined to disagree with everything I said. Instead of trying to convince him directly, I began asking him a series of questions that I knew he would answer with yes. I started with obvious truths. You want to improve your communication skills, don't you? Yes. You believe that effective speaking can help advance your career? Yes. You'd agree that practice is important for developing any skill? Yes. By the time I reached my main point, that he should participate more actively in our class exercises, he found himself nodding in agreement almost automatically. He had created a mental pattern of saying yes to me, which made it much easier for him to continue agreeing when I presented my actual request. This experience taught me what I call the yes ladder principle. When you get people saying yes to small things, they become psychologically primed to say yes to bigger things. It's based on a fundamental aspect of human psychology, our need for consistency. Once we take a position or express an agreement, we feel internal pressure to remain consistent with that stance. The key is starting with agreements that are so obvious and uncontroversial that the other person would look foolish disagreeing. These aren't trick questions or manipulative traps. They're genuine points of common ground that establish a foundation for cooperation. I remember using this technique with a business owner who was resistant to implementing a training program for his employees. Instead of launching into arguments about the benefits of training, I began with questions we both knew he would answer affirmatively. You want your business to be as successful as possible, don't you? You believe your employees are one of your most important assets. You'd agree that helping good people become even better benefits everyone. Each yes response made him more receptive to the next question, and more importantly, more open to considering my eventual proposal. By the time I suggested the training program, he was already in a mindset of agreement and cooperation rather than resistance and skepticism. The technique works because it changes the entire dynamic of the conversation. Instead of creating an adversarial situation where you're trying to overcome objections, you're building a collaborative atmosphere where both parties are working toward common goals. The other person stops looking for reasons to disagree and starts looking for ways to maintain the positive momentum you've created together. I learned to identify the underlying beliefs and values that my audience already held, then frame my requests in ways that aligned with those existing commitments. If I was speaking to parents about education, I would start with their obvious desire for their children's success. If I was addressing business professionals, I would begin with their shared commitment to excellence and growth. The power of this approach extends beyond getting immediate agreement. When people say yes to you repeatedly, they begin to see themselves as someone who supports and cooperates with you. This self-perception influences their future interactions with you, making them more likely to be helpful and supportive in ongoing relationships. I discovered that the questions you choose are crucial to the technique's effectiveness. They must Be genuine, relevant to your ultimate goal, and obviously true from the other person's perspective. Artificial or manipulative questions will backfire, creating suspicion and resistance rather than cooperation. The most elegant application of this principle involves helping people recognize that your request actually serves their own stated values and goals. When someone realizes that saying yes to you means saying yes to something they already want, the decision becomes easy and natural. I also learnt the importance of pacing. You can't rush through a series of yes questions. One needs time to register and be genuinely considered. The goal isn't to create a rapid-fire series of agreements, but to build a thoughtful progression of shared understanding that leads naturally to cooperation. This technique has served me well in countless situations, from gaining support for new educational programs to resolving conflicts between difficult personalities. When you master the art of getting people to say yes, you're not manipulating them, you're helping them. Recognize the logical consistency of supporting something that aligns with their own best interests and highest values. I keep a collection of questions in a worn notebook that has become one of my most valuable tools for influence. These aren't ordinary questions, they're carefully crafted inquiries designed to get people talking about what matters most to them. Over the years, I've discovered that the right question at the right moment can be more powerful than the most eloquent speech. The insight came to me during a frustrating negotiation with a school board that seemed determined to reject my teaching proposal. I had prepared extensive arguments, compelling statistics, and persuasive testimonials, but every point I made seemed to generate more resistance and skepticism from the board members. Finally, in desperation, I stopped talking and started asking questions. What concerns you most about trying new educational approaches? What would an ideal training program look like from your perspective? What results would you need to see to consider this a success? Something remarkable happened. As the board members began answering my questions, they started talking themselves into supporting the program. They identified the exact benefits they were looking for, described their vision of success, and even began suggesting ways to implement the training more effectively. By the end of the meeting, they were enthusiastic supporters of an idea they had initially opposed. This experience taught me a profound truth about human psychology. People are far more convinced by their own words than by anything you could say to them. When you help someone articulate their own thoughts and feelings, they become invested in the ideas they've expressed. They're not just agreeing with you, they're agreeing with themselves. The key is learning to ask questions that guide people toward discovering insights on their own. Instead of telling someone why they should care about your proposal, you ask questions that help them realize why it matters to them. Instead of listing the benefits of your idea, you ask them to describe what benefits would be most valuable. In their situation, I developed what I call discovery questions, inquiries, that help people explore their own thinking and uncover their true motivations. Questions like, what's been your experience with similar situations? What would success look like from your perspective? What concerns would you want addressed before moving forward? These questions accomplish several important things simultaneously. They show genuine interest in the other person's perspective. They provide valuable information about their real needs and concerns. And most importantly, they create an environment where people feel heard and understood before you ask them to consider your ideas. I remember working with a particularly difficult student named Robert who seemed determined to challenge every concept I presented. Instead of arguing with his objections, I began asking him questions about his experiences and perspectives. What examples have you seen where these principles didn't work? What approach do you think would be more effective? What has been most helpful in your own development? As Robert answered these questions, something fascinating happened. He began identifying many of the same principles I was teaching, but in his own words and from his own experience. He wasn't just learning my concepts, he was rediscovering them through his own reflection and analysis. By the end of our conversation, he had become one of my most engaged and supportive students. The power of this approach lies in its respect for human intelligence and autonomy. Instead of treating people as passive recipients of your wisdom, you're inviting them to be active participants in the discovery process. You're acknowledging that they have valuable insights and experiences that contribute to the conversation. I learned that the best questions are often the simplest ones. What do you think? How does that feel to you? What's your experience been? These open-ended inquiries give people permission to share their real thoughts and feelings, which provides you with invaluable information about how to connect with them effectively. The technique also works because it satisfies people's need to be heard and understood. Most individuals spend their days feeling like their opinions don't matter or their perspectives aren't valued. When you ask thoughtful questions and listen carefully to their answers, you're giving them a rare gift, the experience of being truly heard. Asterisk. The ultimate goal isn't to manipulate people into agreeing with you, but to create genuine dialogue where both parties can explore ideas together and arrive at solutions that work for everyone involved. When you master the art of letting others do the talking through skillful questioning, you become a facilitator of insight rather than a dispenser of information. I have a file folder labeled Idea Planting Success Stories that contains some of my most satisfying professional achievements. These aren't cases where I convinced someone to accept my ideas. They're situations where I helped others discover brilliant insights that happened to align perfectly with what I had hoped to accomplish. The art of making others feel like your ideas are theirs became one of my most valuable skills for creating lasting change. The technique crystallized for me during a challenging situation with a school principal who was resistant to modernizing his teaching methods. I had a clear vision of what needed to change, but every direct suggestion I made was met with skepticism and resistance. He seemed determined to maintain traditional approaches regardless of their effectiveness. Instead of continuing to present my ideas as external recommendations, I began asking questions that would lead him to discover the same insights on his own. I started with observations about his goals. You mentioned wanting to improve student engagement. What teaching methods have you seen that really capture students' attention? As he answered, I asked follow-up questions that gently guided his thinking. What is it about those methods that makes them effective? How do you think students today differ from students 20 years ago? What would happen if we designed our teaching approaches around those differences? Over the course of several conversations, he began developing ideas that were remarkably similar to what I had originally wanted to suggest, but now they were his ideas, born from his own analysis and reflection. When he finally proposed implementing changes that aligned with my initial vision, he did so with enthusiasm and ownership that no amount of external persuasion could have created. This experience taught me that people have fundamental psychological needs when it comes to ideas. They want to feel intelligent, and they want to maintain their autonomy. When you present someone with a fully formed idea and ask them to accept it, you're inadvertently threatening both of these needs. You're implying that they weren't smart enough to think of it themselves, and you're asking them to surrender their independence by accepting your thinking. But when you help people discover ideas through their own reasoning process, you're honoring both their intelligence and their autonomy. They get to feel smart for having developed the insight, and they maintain complete ownership of their decision to act on it. I learned to become what I call an idea gardener, someone who plants seeds of thought and then creates conditions for them to grow naturally. This requires patience, skill, and a deep understanding of how people think and what motivates them. The key is learning to ask the right sequence of questions that will lead someone down a logical path toward the conclusion you hope they'll reach. You can't force this process or rush it. You have to trust that if the idea truly makes sense, Thoughtful people will discover it when given the right guidance. I remember working with a business owner who needed to improve his employee communication, but was convinced that formal training was unnecessary. Instead of arguing for training programs, I asked him to analyze his most successful periods when your team performed at its absolute best. What was different about communication during those times? What conditions would need to exist for that level of communication to happen consistently? Through this guided self-analysis, he identified the exact elements that effective training could provide. When he eventually decided to implement a communication development program, he presented it to his employees as his own insight into what would make their team more successful. The beauty of this approach is that people become passionate advocates for ideas they believe they've discovered themselves. They don't just accept the idea, they champion it. They don't just implement it, they improve it. They don't just follow it, they take ownership of making it successful. This technique works particularly well in group settings where you want to build consensus around a new direction. Instead of presenting your vision and trying to convince everyone to accept it, you can facilitate a discussion where the group collectively discovers the same insights and develops shared ownership of the solution. The most satisfying applications of this principle are when you see people taking ideas you helped them discover and developing them far beyond what you originally envisioned. They add their own creativity, apply their unique perspective, and create something even better than what you had initially imagined. In those moments, you realize that the best influence doesn't just change minds, it unleashes potential. I received a letter that began with words I'll never forget. Mr. Carnegie, I hate everything about your teaching methods, your philosophy, and your approach to human development. You're a fraud who preys on people's insecurities. The letter was from a man named Frank who had attended one of my lectures and found it deeply offensive. My first instinct was to dismiss his criticism as the rant of a disturbed individual. Instead, I did something that surprised even me. I wrote back expressing genuine sympathy for his feelings and asking him to help me understand his perspective better. I said, "You obviously feel strongly about these issues, and I respect that. I'd like to understand what specifically troubled you about my approach, because your concerns might help me become more effective." That letter led to a correspondence that lasted several months and ultimately transformed one of my harshest critics into a valued friend and supporter. The key was my willingness to acknowledge his feelings as valid and important, even when I disagreed with his conclusions. This experience taught me one of the most powerful phrases in human communication. I don't blame you for feeling that way. If I were in your position, I'd probably feel the same. These words have an almost magical ability to disarm anger, reduce defensiveness, and open the door to genuine understanding. The phrase works because it acknowledges something that most people rarely receive validation for their emotional experience. When someone is upset, angry, or frustrated, they're not usually looking for solutions or advice. They're looking for understanding and recognition that their feelings make sense given their circumstances. Most people respond to emotional outbursts by trying to talk the other person out of their feelings. "You shouldn't feel that way," or "that's not a logical response," or "you're overreacting." These responses, however well-intentioned, usually escalate the emotional intensity because they invalidate the person's experience. But when you respond with honest sympathy and understanding, you're giving the person what they really need, that their feelings are legitimate and understandable. Once they feel heard and validated, they become much more open to discussion and problem solving. I learned to distinguish between agreeing with someone's conclusions and understanding their feelings. You can acknowledge that someone's anger or frustration makes perfect sense given their perspective without accepting their interpretation of events or their proposed solutions. I remember a particularly volatile situation with a student named Margaret, who was furious about a grade she had received. She stormed into my office, making accusations about unfairness and favoritism. Instead of defending my grading decision or explaining why she was wrong, I began with sympathy. "Margaret, I can see you're really upset about this grade, and I understand why you would be. Getting a result you didn't expect, especially when you worked hard, would be frustrating for anyone." This response immediately changed the dynamic of our conversation. Her anger began to dissipate because she felt heard and understood. Once she calmed down, we were able to have a productive discussion about her work and how she could improve in the future. What started as a confrontational encounter became a valuable learning experience for both of us. The key to making this technique authentic is developing genuine empathy for others' experiences. This means taking the time to truly understand their perspective, their pressures, and their concerns. It means recognizing that people's emotional responses usually make sense when you understand their full situation. I discovered that this approach works particularly well in conflict resolution. When two people are in disagreement, each party typically wants the other to understand their position first. By offering understanding and sympathy to both sides, you can create an environment where productive problem-solving becomes possible. The technique also prevents you from taking others' negative emotions personally. When someone is angry or upset, it's usually about their situation, not about you personally. When you respond with understanding rather than defensiveness, you avoid escalating conflicts and maintain your ability to be helpful. I learned that honest sympathy is different from empty platitudes or manipulative agreement. People can sense the difference between genuine understanding and superficial acknowledgement. True sympathy requires you to invest the emotional energy to really comprehend someone else's experience and respond with authentic compassion. The most profound applications of this principle occur when you use it with people who are being difficult or unreasonable. Instead of matching their emotional intensity or trying to argue them out of their feelings, you offer the understanding they're seeking. This often transforms the entire relationship and opens possibilities for cooperation that seemed impossible before. I keep a collection of what I call noble reasons in my desk, examples of how I've learned to frame requests in terms of people's highest aspirations rather than their immediate self. This collection represents one of my most important discoveries about human motivation. People desperately want to feel good about their decisions and actions, and they need reasons that allow them to see themselves as honorable and worthy. The insight came during a difficult situation with a wealthy businessman who was refusing to pay a legitimate debt to a smaller company. The creditor had tried every conventional approach: legal threats, financial pressure, appeals to fairness, but nothing worked. When they asked for my advice, I suggested a completely different strategy. Instead of focusing on the legal obligation or the financial hardship he was causing, I suggested appealing to his sense of honor and reputation. The letter we sent said something like, "We know you're a man who takes pride in your integrity and fair dealing. Your reputation in the business community speaks to your character and values. We're confident that once you review this situation, you'll want to resolve it in a way that reflects the high standards you've always maintained." The response was immediate and positive. Within a week, he had not only paid the debt, but had also written a letter apologizing for the delay and expressing appreciation for the respectful way the matter had been handled. The appeal to his noble motives had accomplished what legal pressure couldn't achieve. This experience taught me that most people want to see themselves as honest, fair, generous, and honorable. Even when they're acting in ways that contradict these values, they prefer to believe they're fundamentally good people who occasionally make mistakes, rather than bad people who occasionally do good things. When you give people a noble reason for doing what you want them to do, you're providing them with a way to maintain their positive self-image while taking the action you've requested. You're helping them feel good about their decision, rather than forcing them to act against their self-concept. I learned to identify the higher motives that drive different types of people. Business leaders often respond to appeals about their reputation and legacy. Parents are motivated by concerns for their children's welfare and future. Professionals care about their expertise and contribution to their field. When you understand what makes someone feel noble and worthy, you can frame your requests in those terms. The key is finding the genuine nobility in what you're asking someone to do. This isn't about manufacturing false reasons or manipulating people with empty flattery. It's about identifying the truly positive aspects of your request and highlighting those elements in your communication. I remember working with a school board that was reluctant to fund an innovative education program. Instead of focusing on costs and logistics, I framed the discussion around their role as community leaders and their opportunity to give children advantages that would serve them throughout their lives. I talked about their legacy and their chance to be pioneers in educational excellence. This approach transformed their perspective on the decision. Instead of seeing the program as an expensive risk, they began seeing it as an investment in their community's future and a reflection of their commitment to excellence. They ultimately not only approved the funding, but also became enthusiastic advocates for the program. The technique works because it aligns your request with the person's deepest values and aspirations. When someone can see how your request serves their highest ideals, the decision becomes easy and satisfying. They're not just helping you, they're expressing their best selves. I discovered that this approach is particularly effective with people who have strong egos or high status. These individuals are often resistant to requests that make them feel diminished or manipulated. But when you appeal to their noble motives, you're actually elevating their self-image and giving them a chance to demonstrate their finest qualities. The principle also works because it creates positive emotions around compliance. When people act on noble motives, they feel proud, satisfied, and virtuous. These positive feelings become associated with you and with the action they've taken, making them more likely to respond favorably to future requests. I learned to phrase my appeals in ways that emphasize the person's opportunity to demonstrate their values. I know you care deeply about quality and excellence, or given your commitment to helping others succeed, or because of your reputation for fairness and integrity. The most satisfying applications of this principle occur when you help people discover that doing what's right also serves their interests. When noble motives and practical benefits align, you create the strongest possible motivation for positive action. People get to feel good about themselves while also achieving their goals, a combination that creates lasting satisfaction and loyalty. I have a list of what I call impossible tasks that I've given to students over the years, challenges they initially said couldn't be done, but ultimately accomplished with remarkable success. This collection represents one of my most powerful discoveries about human motivation. People are energized by challenges that seem difficult but achievable, and they often perform far beyond their own expectations when given the right kind of inspiring test. The insight came when I was working with a particularly timid student named Eleanor, who seemed convinced she could never speak effectively in public. Instead of trying to reassure her or minimize the difficulty of public speaking, I decided to try something completely different. I gave her what appeared to be an impossible challenge: to deliver a presentation to our city's business leaders about education reform within 2 weeks. Her initial reaction was exactly what you'd expect: protest and insistence that such a task was far beyond her capabilities. But something interesting happened over the following days. Instead of giving up, she began preparing with an intensity and focus I had never seen from her before. The challenge had awakened something in her that gentle encouragement never could. When the day arrived, Eleanor delivered one of the most compelling presentations I had ever witnessed. She spoke with passion, clarity, and conviction that surprised everyone in the room, including herself. After her talk, she told me that the apparent impossibility of the task had somehow freed her from her usual self-consciousness. She had been so focused on meeting the challenge that she forgot to be afraid. This experience taught me that people have a deep psychological need to prove themselves capable of significant achievement. When you give someone a meaningful challenge that stretches their abilities, you're offering them something precious, an opportunity to discover capabilities they didn't know they possessed. The key is framing the challenge in a way that feels inspiring rather than overwhelming. The task must seem difficult enough to be meaningful, but achievable enough to be worth attempting. You're looking for what I call the sweet spot of challenge, hard enough to require growth, but not so hard as to seem impossible. I learned to present challenges as opportunities for people to demonstrate their best qualities. Instead of saying this will be difficult for you, I would say this is exactly the kind of challenge that will showcase your talents. Instead of focusing on the risk of failure, I would emphasize the excitement of achievement. I remember working with a business manager named Thomas who had been avoiding a difficult conversation with an underperforming employee. Instead of giving him advice about how to handle the situation, I challenged him to demonstrate the leadership skills I knew he possessed. I said, "Thomas, this is your chance to show what exceptional leadership looks like. Most managers avoid these conversations, but great leaders see them as opportunities to help people grow." This reframing transformed his entire approach to the situation. Instead of dreading the conversation, he began preparing for it, as if it were an opportunity to demonstrate his finest abilities. The discussion went remarkably well, resulting in improved performance and a stronger relationship with the employee. The principle works because challenges engage our competitive instincts and our desire for achievement. When someone presents you with a meaningful test, it activates psychological mechanisms that can override fear, self-doubt, and procrastination. The challenge becomes more compelling than the obstacles. I discovered that the most effective challenges are those that align with the person's existing values and aspirations. If someone cares about quality, challenge them to achieve excellence. If they value helping others, challenge them to make a significant difference. If they pride themselves on their competence, challenge them to master something new. The technique also works because it changes the person's relationship with difficulty. Instead of seeing obstacles as reasons to avoid action, they begin seeing them as puzzles to solve and barriers to overcome. The challenge reframes struggle as part of the adventure rather than evidence of impossibility. I learned to celebrate effort and progress, not just final results. When someone accepts a meaningful challenge, they're already demonstrating courage and commitment. Acknowledging these qualities throughout the process helps maintain motivation and builds confidence for future challenges. The most profound applications of this principle occur when you help people set challenges for themselves. When someone creates their own meaningful test, they become fully invested in achieving it. They're not just trying to please you or meet external expectations. They're proving something important to themselves. People remember the challenges they've overcome long after they forget the advice they've received. When you give someone an inspiring challenge and support them in meeting it, you're giving them a story of personal achievement that will motivate them for years to come. 20 years after I taught my first public speaking class, I began receiving letters that changed my understanding of what true influence really means. These weren't just thank you notes or updates on career progress. They were detailed accounts of how the principles I had shared had transformed not just careers, but entire lives, families, and communities. These letters taught me that influence isn't just about getting what you want in the moment. It's about creating positive change that ripples outward through time. One letter particularly moved me. It came from a former student named David, who wrote about how the confidence he gained in my class had enabled him to start his own business. which now employed dozens of people in his small town. But what struck me most was his description of how he was using the same principles to mentor young entrepreneurs, creating what he called a chain of positive influence that was spreading far beyond anything I could have imagined. This correspondence helped me realize that the most powerful influence isn't the kind that serves your immediate needs. It's the kind that empowers others to become influencers themselves. When you teach someone to connect authentically with others, you're not just solving your own problems or achieving your own goals. You're multiplying your positive impact through every person they touch throughout their lifetime. I began to see my role differently. Instead of simply being someone who could persuade others to take action, I wanted to become someone who could teach others to build meaningful relationships and inspire positive change in their own spheres of influence. This shift in perspective transformed not just my teaching, but my entire approach to human interaction. The principles I've shared with you: genuine interest, sincere appreciation, empathetic listening, and authentic concern for others' welfare. These aren't just techniques for getting what you want. They're the foundation of a life philosophy that can transform how you relate to every person you encounter. When you consistently apply these principles, you become someone who makes others feel valued, understood, and empowered. But here's what I've learned about influence that took me years to fully understand. The most profound changes happen gradually, through countless small interactions that build trust, respect, and genuine affection over time. Each conversation where you show authentic interest, each moment when you make someone feel important, each time you listen with genuine care, these seemingly minor interactions accumulate into a reputation and relationships that become your greatest assets. I think about the students who learned not just to speak more effectively, but to connect more authentically with their families. The business professionals who applied these principles to create more positive work environments. The parents who used these insights to build stronger relationships with their children. The community leaders who used these skills to bring people together around shared goals. This is the true legacy of influence, not the immediate results you achieve, but the long-term positive changes you inspire in others, who then go on to inspire positive changes in still others. It's a multiplication effect that can extend far beyond your own lifetime. I've come to believe that everyone has the opportunity to create this kind of lasting positive influence, regardless of their position or circumstances. You don't need a title, a platform, or special credentials to make others feel valued and understood. You just need the commitment to approach each interaction with genuine care for the other person's welfare and authentic interest in their perspective. The compound effect of this approach is remarkable. When you consistently make others feel important and understood, you build a network of people who trust you, respect you, and want to support your endeavors. But more importantly, you inspire them to treat others with the same consideration and respect, creating ripples of positive influence that extend far beyond your direct relationships. As I reflect on my career and the thousands of people I've had the privilege to teach and learn from, I'm most proud not of the immediate successes or the recognition I received, but of the reports I continue to receive about former students who are using these principles to create positive change in their own communities and relationships. Your influence legacy isn't determined by how many people you can convince to do what you want. It's determined by how many people you inspire to become more effective, more compassionate, and more authentic in their own relationships with others. When you help someone become a better friend, spouse, parent, or colleague, you've created influence that will benefit countless others throughout their lifetime. I want to leave you with a simple template that has guided thousands of my students toward becoming genuinely influential people. It's not complicated or sophisticated. In fact, its power lies in its simplicity. This framework represents the essence of everything I've learned about authentic human influence, distilled into practical steps you can begin implementing immediately. The foundation starts with a single commitment: to become genuinely interested in other people's welfare and success. This isn't a technique or a strategy, it's a fundamental orientation toward life that sees every interaction as an opportunity to add value to someone else's experience. When this becomes your default approach, everything else I've taught you will flow naturally from this foundation. Here's your immediate action plan. Tomorrow morning, before you check your email or dive into your daily tasks, identify 3 people you'll interact with during the day. For each person, commit to doing one specific thing. Find something genuinely worthy of appreciation and express it sincerely. Notice how this simple practice changes both their response to you and your own mindset throughout the day. Next, practice the art of asking better questions. Instead of dominating conversations with your own thoughts and experiences, become curious about others' perspectives and challenges. Ask follow-up questions that show you're genuinely interested in understanding their world. Pay attention to how people respond when they feel truly heard and understood. Begin implementing the principle of talking in terms of others' interests. Before you make any request or present any idea, ask yourself, how does this serve their goals and values? Frame your communication in ways that highlight the benefits they care about most. Watch how this approach reduces resistance and increases cooperation. Start each week by identifying one relationship that could benefit from improved communication. Apply the principles of making others feel important, listening more effectively, or appealing to their higher motives. Track the changes you observe over time, both in their responses and in the quality of your relationship. Most importantly, remember that influence is a practice, not a destination. You'll have days when you forget these principles and fall back into old patterns of self-focused communication. This is normal and expected. The key is returning to these practices with patience and persistence, understanding that authentic influence develops gradually through consistent application. I want to challenge you to think beyond your immediate goals and consider the long-term impact of your influence. How do you want people to feel after interacting with you? What kind of positive change do you want to inspire in others? What legacy do you want to create through your relationships and communications? The principles I've shared aren't just about becoming more effective at getting what you want. They're about becoming the kind of person others want to be around, work with, and support. They're about creating genuine connections that enrich both your life and the lives of everyone you encounter. As you begin this journey, remember that every expert was once a beginner. Every person who seems naturally charismatic and influential once struggled with the same challenges you're facing now. The difference isn't talent or natural ability. It's the commitment to continuously improve how you relate to and communicate with others. Start small, be consistent, and trust the process. Apply one principle at a time until it becomes natural. Then add another. Focus on progress, not perfection. Celebrate the small victories and learn from the setbacks. Most importantly, remember that the goal isn't to manipulate or control others, but to create authentic connections that serve everyone's highest good. The world needs more people who understand how to influence through genuine care, authentic interest, and sincere appreciation for others. By committing to this path, you're not just improving your own effectiveness, you're contributing to a more connected, understanding, and cooperative world. Your influence journey begins with your very next interaction. Make it count.